Welcome to Spiritual Studies session 43. This session is going to give a focus onto the many concepts seen and all about the Aboriginals of Australia. This session is going to give a broad stroke as to their historical context, their cosmogony, their philosophy, their concept of the afterlife, a few deities, and some cultural motifs. Now, I will reiterate throughout, as I have with many other sessions, that this group of people, the Aboriginals of Australia, are many, and historically were even more. So everything that I say bears a hedging, bears a context that I'm trying to give an overview. And in certain ways, this is overly simplistic. With the Sami people, for instance, there were many groups. In this case, the Aboriginals, there are even more groups. This would be even more apparent if I were to make one session covering the Native Americans as a whole, because there are many, many, many. But for what I can do within the span of an hour, we will be giving this focus. So when it comes to the Aboriginals, the ancestry, the dating of their arrival in Australia is a very curious topic. The first human remains, and by human, distinctly Homo sapien, outside of Africa, can be found in Australia, and this dates 50,000 years ago. 50,000. And you can find artifacts that date back 65,000 years ago. You can find evidence of the use of fire. This dates back 120,000 years ago. Genetic evidence points to at least 80,000 years ago, ranging up to 125,000 years ago. So when it comes to the last person, anatomically, 50,000, 42,000 years ago. However, the artifacts, however, the signs of inhabitation, all the way back to 125. Now, conservative estimates would put a migration from Africa to Australia somewhere between 64,000 to 75,000 years ago. And that this may have involved more than one migration. That this would have taken place via boat. And that perhaps there were as few as 2,000 women that would forge the diversity seen in this nation. This would have been, again, seafaring. So note the level of intelligence there, which we're going to mention something interesting about that later on. Now, to have traveled to Australia so long ago, they would have seen species that has not been seen anywhere near. I hope that makes sense. They would have seen long extinct species. Their closest relatives would have been the Melanesians and the Papua New Guinea natives. and that this split between them would have happened 32,000 years ago, roughly. And we saw this interesting case where um, the Polynesians, as they had moved from apparently Taiwan, seemed to have had little interaction with the Aboriginals, seem to have. However, a large constitution of their people would inhabit their neighbor in New Zealand. We do see later that there were definite signs of trade between the Aboriginals and their northern neighbors. When it came to their lifestyle, this isn't too shocking to say that we see hunter-gatherer, we see forager lifestyles, nomadic, semi-nomadic, and permanent. What needs the people had, these different tribes would have, would depend on where they lived from region to region. If they were to move, if they were to not move, if they were to stay put, it all depended on food supply, weather, geography. And you can still find these archaeological evidence and still yet the tradition of making canoes out of bark. So to give further weight to the history here, the rock art found in Australia is twice as old as the pyramids. This is a shocking case of isolation where what was happening before they moved from Africa was more or less retained throughout all this time prior to colonialization. And of course, when colonialization happened, smallpox broke out, massacres, conflicts over the frontier, a giant depopulation. There was a great diversity of languages prior to European settlement, over 250, it's said. And nowadays, it could be anywhere between 120 and 145 in use, but the only ones that are not said to be endangered are 13. So if you imagine that a people take over Europe, and many people aren't aware of truly how many languages are spoken in Europe, by proportion, say now that there's only about 3. That's the level that we're talking here. Prior to the European settlement, there was a maintained slash and burn technique that would have maintained nutrients in the soil. We saw this was also the case I live here in the Pacific Northwest. When the natives were running the show, these wildfires were planned and you tended to nature. You take care of nature by doing so. However, by introducing herding animals, sheep and cattle, this ruined it. This ruined the soil. And back when, they had all manner of tools. They could make baskets, they could make nets, they could make bags. They had their trading networks, as I noted on before, via their canoes. They had boomerangs and spears, axes, or not axes, well, in some cases, axes, tools for fishing. They also had this use of a message stick, which would be effectively a stick with some engravings to put to communicate between places. Now, when it comes to the common conception of the Aboriginals, one of the first things that is ever brought up, it's almost a cliche, is the Dreamtime, Aboriginal Dreamtime. And this is something to question, because we are taking a concept from a language and an understanding of the world completely outside of the mindset cultivated by the Western world. And we are ham-fistingly translating it into what we know. A trippy consideration of language is how we think of the world is crafted by the words of which we use to describe it. So, Dreamtime might be a little too bland, might be a little bit too assumptive. Now, with the Maori in New Zealand, you're starting to see an integration of the native terms into the English language via loan words. And in this way, it would be far more respectful and honoring to use the terms as the Aboriginals use them. So one of them is Mangai, Jukper, Juker, Jukerpa. I'm apologizing now, as I have in many sessions. I read, I don't speak. This will become a lot more apparent when I'm speaking on the deities later in the session. I mean nothing but respect. I just pronunciations, man. Anyhow, so for us to believe that we fully understand a complex of meanings, the word epistemology, uh, to think that we have a true mental wraparound of this concept is a bit much. It would take being within the cultural context to really give the breadth that it deserves. The dreaming is frequently touted as a timelessness. So it's not a matter of past, present, or future. These concepts of past, present, and future is Western. I know it's gone across the world now. You can see the soupy grounds I'm in. So in this way, the other definition is not dreaming, but every when. Every when. Every when is now. Gosh, I'm fumbling even trying to get it. As a digression, but I think illustrates the point, a similar topic is in looking at all of these different spiritualities, paganisms, shamanisms, what have you, polytheisms, we use the term gods a lot. But what does that mean? What does gods mean? A force of nature? A celestial body? An influence above the power of mankind? An aspect of existence? What does gods mean? So in this way, what does time mean? Anyhow. So, Dreamtime. In the stories of the ancient culture, they're called Dreamtime stories by our translation. And in these places and times and stories, every person exists forever. Everything exists forever. We'll get into this more as we go along. But the dreaming era was the era before the world as we recognize it was created. And that this beginning was where all creation came from. That in this beginning, there were only spirit beings that formed creation. And that these gods, you see, these spirit beings, you see, traveled across a place without form. It is said in the legends that in this time it was bare. No animals, no plants, no humans, no trees, no nothing. Well, no nothing, that's a bit of a paradox. In that one of these versions, there is Wagina, that is understood as cloud and rain spirit, the creator that brought all the ancestors from within the earth and over the seas and began life. So here in one version, we're seeing a creator. Some of these ancestors that were called forth, they existed, but in a potentiation, in a potential state. They were called forth and actualized. Some of them were like men, and others were like animals. But we also see this case of the shape shifting. Man to animal, animal to man. Its spirit form can move seamlessly between, like in a dream, how you're here and then you're there. The boundaries are not there. They're very loose, if at all. It is forbidden in some tribes to speak the name of the creator, to speak it publicly. This is a taboo. In certain legends, the spirits, the gods, fight amongst themselves. In their fights in this early time, they created mountains, they created lakes, they created rivers, carves in the earth with their fights. Does this not remind you of the Greeks, the Titans, and the Olympian gods? It's to say that if the Aboriginals have been isolated for what, 80,000 years, that these story patterns, and we'll see some similarities later with the Native Americans, these story patterns precede all history, that they would stem all the way back to Africa and who knows how much further. So this trope, gods arriving from the sky, gods with powers, the creation of the world and of humanity, of its features, and of conflicts amongst themselves for disobediences. In another version of a creation story, the same for the beginning. It was bare, it was dry and empty. And then comes the rainbow serpent. And this is a common thread between, I would say, most, if not all, of the Aboriginal tribes. That the rainbow serpent awoke and traveled in all directions to find the people and found nothing. And as he was searching, or she, because the sex does change depending, her body carved gouges in the land, ravines and such. And finding that the rainbow serpent was all alone, he, I'm going to switch up the pronouns here, called out to the frogs, told the frogs to come out. And the frogs burst water from their mouths. And this filled the ravines, this filled the gorges, this filled the lakes, and created rivers and streams. And this began grasses and trees to grow and added color all across the landscape. And since the setting was set, the rainbow serpent woke up The rest of the animals, again, they live in a state of potentiation, and they come out and they're glad. They're glad that there's food. They're glad that there's water. They're glad that they can provide for their people. And the rainbow serpent makes rules for people to obey. This is metaphysics here. Makes rules that must be obeyed. And if they are broken, they will be turned to stone and they will be made into mountains. And if they're followed, they are rewarded by becoming humans. So it's interesting that to be human is a very grateful thing to be. Curious contrast there. And in this version, one day it starts to rain, and it rains and rains and rains. And this is the flood myth. And that two men come to the rainbow serpent asking for shelter. And the rainbow serpent says, "You can crawl into my mouth and I'll hold you there." And they do. And the people soon realize that these two young men are missing. And the serpent seems to feel shame or something to that effect, deciding not to get caught, and flees into the sky. And once seeing the sadness that the tribe had for their two missing men, the rainbow serpent decides to become a rainbow, a beautiful arc of colors. So this trope, this rainbow serpent, and mind you, I talked about this quite a bit in the snake mythology talk, if you're curious, is related to the many seasons. And in the living world, the different colors that the earth wears is everything. So the rainbow serpent is a direct analogy for the metaphysical reality of the world of which we live. And this association with water is a strong one. That when an area is dry or goes into drought, it's because the rainbow serpent hasn't been there recently. And if it plumes, if it floods, if it's lush, the rainbow serpent has. And so this is the giving of life, because without water, there is no life. The beginning time was dry and barren. And the difference now is the rainbow serpent, the water. This is what gives life. That the spirit of life itself lives within the water and belongs to the rainbow serpent. And the creator of humanity, the creator of the abundance of the world, right? All manner of rainfall, all oceans, all rivers, all lushness in the land. And to anger this entity would be to bring floods, that you might be consumed by the rainbow serpent and turned into stone. And that the rainbow serpent also endows certain ancestral blessings that can gift magical powers to individuals or progeny, but can also give curses that will go down, ancestral karma, ancestral curses. So it's this kind of omnipotent force that is also likened to a fertility god, because again, you can't live without the water, without the colors. So all manner of fertility back to the rainbow serpent. That all manner of reproducing back to the rainbow serpent. That in these depictions too, is sometimes wearing a kangaroo's head or a crocodile's tail, but the body is always that of a snake. Now, there's a theory that this symbol is tied to the discovery of the pipefish. That way back when, as the ice age was receding, that the rising seas would have brought pipefish to the attention of the Aboriginals. And during this time of um, challenge, because the habitat had changed, food supplies had changed, everything had been messed up, that the tribes would have been at ends with each other. They might have been warring with each other. And during this trepidatious time, this strange entity of the pipefish might have become a symbol of unification for them. Thus, why you see the rainbow serpent across all tribes. Um, a theory, interesting theory. Now, in regards to the afterlife, it is said that those who pass on go to the land of the dead, which is the sky world. This is not uncommon for shamanic cultures. As long as certain rituals were held, one could assuredly be sent to the land of the dead. Now, this is a curious tie, because where do we see something like this? Ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt, and many other cultures, mind you, was very firm on the point of you have to perform certain ceremonies for the dead in order to ensure their safe travel. Curious, that root of Africa, huh? Now there is a place as well, the Bragu, which is a particular place where the dead can become, in my understanding, and I hope I'm not getting anything wrong, they become the sacredness of the very place itself. And that this is why the place is so sacred and ought not be disturbed, ruined, pillaged, excavated, yada, yada, yada. It's our ancestors. You honor them. How dare you, right? But there's this never-ending cycle aspect that people become spirits, that animals become spirits, and spirits become people, spirits become animals. That there is a cycle. This is the eternal dreaming. This is the dream time. This is the everywhen. That death is a move onto the next dreamland, and that this dreamland is a move to the next dreamland, and that it's always going in back on itself. It's a circle. And again, this is not samsara. This is not the grievous wheel. This is not a curse. This is the way it is. This is something to be grateful for. Oh. So in this way, your death is a rebirth. Mm. Mm-mm-mm-mm-mm. You may also be said to go to the land of the dreaming ancestors, where the gods are. I say gods in air quotes here. And if we're taking a book out of the old shamanic, which mind you, we're really not seeing heavy shamanic vibes when it comes to the Aboriginals. I could have looked deeper. I could be very wrong about that. But you see that this is hearkening to the upper world as we see in the shamanic. So, without saying too much, again, these beliefs depend on where you are, depending on what groups you're talking to. Some groups would have a nuanced discussion about the nature of humans having two souls, and that upon death, they merge together. In some cases, you would see burials needing to be as concealed as possible, that the body would be covered in all manner of things to stop their spirit from haunting the group. This might be in cases of those. That's interesting. I'm not going to get too far into that. And in these certain cases too, we'll see that dead people are buried with their possessions. We see this all across the ancient world, which, mind you, again, is an interesting hearkening to the Egyptians. And in certain groups, most notably on the northern end of Australia, the name being spoken of the person is forbidden after death. So if you were to refer to somebody, you would give them a substitute name or a nickname, because to say their name after they're dead is to disturb their spirits, to pique up their ears, and to take them away from where they are. So in order to respect them, you let them be where they are, and you don't rip them between two worlds by speaking their name. And in this way, too, they will not carry photographs of the dead. You let them pass on. This is interesting. Now, a very curious tie to the Native Americans here. We're going to start talking about, I don't know, it's not deities, it's just, it's myth, it's story, it's legend, whatever you want to call it. But this is a specific reference to the peoples that lived and live around Victoria. And it's the Crow. The Crow is their trickster. With the Polynesians, we had Maui. With most of the Native Americans, we have Coyote. And with certain Native Americans, we also have the trickster of the Crow. And this is this aspect of a being who demands instant gratification and resists discipline, as it's said. It is a legend that the crow started as a mosquito and pushed itself to become bigger and bigger and bigger, from a mosquito to a fly to a moth, and then the form of a crow. And that this crow will always have a trick, that these tricks don't always go well. But one of these tricks was of great benefit to everybody. And that is the trick of how the crow gave fire to the people. So it's an interesting story here, because it's not just about the crow, it's also about the Pleiades, which, if you've been paying attention to the course, you know that this is quite the ancient trope. Which, mind you, yet again, in Aboriginal legend, the Pleiades are sisters. They're women. That's always the case all around the world. How? I've asked that question before. How? How is that possible? Okay. So these women, the Karatgurk women, the Pleiades, had fire on the end of their sticks, live coals under their digging at the ends of their digging sticks, and they would use the fire to cook yams. Yams are another interesting statement. You know how they had them, the Polynesians had them, and how did they get to the Americas if the Polynesians didn't make it to America? Anyway, Crow one day finds one of their cooked yams and finds that it's tastier than the regular yams. So he goes up and asks them, "Hey, can I get some of that fire?" And so they say no. And so, of course, what does Crow do? Crow starts to think up a trick. So he hides a bunch of snakes underneath an ant mound. And then he says to them, "Hey, I figured out that these ant larvae they're way tastier than these yams. You should come check it out." So they start digging with their sticks, with the fires on the end, and this infuriates and agitates the snakes, and they attack them. And so in defense of themselves, they start poking at them with their sticks, and this sends off coals in various directions. And Crow is right there waiting and gathers the coals and runs with them and goes to the top of a high tree, and up there with the coals now, we see that that the eagle hawk comes and says, "Hey, can I use one of these? I want to cook a possum." And then others start to notice that that crow has fire. So they all start asking and chattering, demanding that they get some of these coals. And so out of frustration, Crow throws them out to the crowd. And that this is a story of how the fire-tailed finch became fire-tailed is by holding the coals on its back. And also why the crow is black. The crow is black because it held all the coals. It charred it black. Now I want to stop and pause right here for a second. You find this exact story with different details in the story of how Coyote got fire. Coyote went up the mountain, found those who had fire, ran, took it from them, tricked them, took it. Um, and the fire, in getting the fire, it required teamwork, and this somehow resulted in this squirrel getting a curved tail, and a number of other animals getting their characteristics. So the same story, but different characters. As an interesting uh, alignment between the natives of America and the Aboriginals of Australia, who by no historical precedent ought to have any mutual stories. I mean, we could speculate, right? Maybe the story passed through the Polynesians that went to the Americas and sent it to them there. Or maybe the story goes all the way to Africa, and that the natives who eventually moved to Siberia and out through the Bering Strait carried it all the way from Africa, as the Australians did when they left from Africa. Ugh. Anyhow, these sisters, I guess out of shame, or I'm not sure how, because it seems rather ambiguous, but they were swept up into the sky, and they were still bearing their fire sticks. And so the Pleiades are the fire sticks of the sisters. And in other stories, there's other ways that this happens. That the Pleiades was a woman, and that she was being preyed upon by the man in the moon, Kadili, and in order to run away, took to the sky, was swept into the sky. And this is exactly like the story of Orion and the Pleiades in Greek. I mean, there are other stories that are even more analogous and similar, where the seven sisters are running away from this man, Gilby. This is the story of Orion chasing the Pleiades, how Orion lusted over them. This is the exact same story with different names. It's shared with the Greeks. How? Ah. So the Pleiades were transformed into stars. And Gilby transforms himself into the morning star in Orion's belt. But there's also another case of the morning star here, and we've seen this across many ancient cultures, that the morning star is always this sacred point of reverence, which most of the time, if not all of the time, it is the planet Venus. And in this case of the Aboriginal story, you see the tale that the first humans to reach Australia were guided by the morning star. So how did they find Australia when they took off in their boats? the morning star, and that this is a point of reverence. Benumber is the name, as I've seen it, and as I might be terribly pronouncing it. That during their travels too, it wasn't just the vision of the morning star, but also this creating of a song line, which is something that I would love to explain further, but I haven't quite gotten down to the root of these song lines. It's interesting that at the pinnacle, at the peak, at the showing of the morning star, it is believed that this is the time to communicate with the dead, to communicate with the ancestors. This is the releasing of their spirits. That during this time of the Morning Star Summit, that zodiacal light reverberates through extraterrestrial dust, as it's said, creating an ambience, a vibe, an alignment of which would make communication with the ancestors possible. So this might be an interesting nod to the many holy days, say like Walpurgis Night, Samhain, and many of these others, Lupercalia, that all these things might have a little bit more scientific, extra-sensual credo than one might assume. These prophets, clairvoyance, oracle sort of stuff. Oh, another curious nod, and I'm not going to try to pronounce the name, I'm sorry, but it's a sun goddess here that we see, a sun goddess. And I want to point this out because this isn't very common. Most of the time throughout mythology, gods, men, male masculinity gets the credit of the sun. But here we have the goddess, and what she does is every morning when she wakes up, she lights a small fire, and this is the first glow of dawn. And she always will decorate her face with a red ochre, and sometimes this powder goes astray and will create a red sunrise. And she'll take a torch that she's lit and she'll walk across the sky, and then as she's coming to a close, in anticipation, she reapplies the red ochre to herself again, creating the sunset colors. And that she eventually will work her way into a tunnel under the earth, back to where she started again. So in many of these cases, we see these stories of gods, in air quotes, of spirits, of these stories that explain the everyday phenomena of which humanity is engaged with. So I want to take a little moment right now. What is myth? The root of religion. What is myth? What is story? And what is dream? Humans arrive. Humans feel a questioning. And does it matter how we answer these questions? You might be already waving the proverbial flag of truth. What about truth? Well, what about truth? What about it? Why does the mountain look that way? Well, you see, here's a story. Whether it's geological, or whether it's abstract, allegorical. At least if it's allegorical, we also have a sense of morality about it. And no matter what, there's a sense of wonder. And so I hope you can see the kind of ambiguousness of this. I'd love to dedicate a whole session to the nature of myth, but I just wanted to point that out. Now, as a cultural trope I want to talk about, it's this concept of the walkabout, this initiation from becoming a boy into becoming a man, which we see in many different forms across the world. And in this case, it was to undergo a long travel across the land. a temporary mobility, and that this walkabout was actually a derogatory term for a while in Australian culture. But as I understand it, many people try to imitate this in the modern day. That this would have been a rite of passage um, for you to become an adult, to transform into an adult. And that this usually would have happened between the ages of 10 and 16, depending on your maturation. The elders would say when you're ready. This journey was to survive, but it wasn't just to survive, it was also to reflect, to it was a spiritual journey as well. And you may have heard me in the course before that, many of these we say these initiations at times were journeys, literal journeys, hikes, but oftentimes they were inward journeys. And in this case, it's both. It's not a sacred medicine induced inward journey. It's an outward journey to survive in the land, which provides an internal growth, reflection, transformation to prove that you could survive in the wilderness, that you were ready to be an adult. This is kind of like a Darwinism sort of thing, right? To prove yourself physically and mentally capable and spiritually in tune enough to pull it off. And that this could be 1,000 miles. And for years as a child, you had been told the secrets of how to pull this off. They didn't just push you out, You had been preparing for this your whole childhood. And that these secrets, maybe knowledge of certain stars, knowledge of plants, which ones are edible, which ones aren't, how to make fire, what you need, how to pull off hunting and fishing out of the bare essentials around you. And in order to claim you as an initiate, this could take the form of body paint. This could take the form of piercings. You would go out in a loincloth. That's it. Get to it. And to think about this, right? Like to think of how coddled the modern man is, right? At what point, I mean, I guess the nearest thing we have is you turning 18 and go out there and get a job, kiddo. But this is a very blurred line, right? Because many people don't leave right away. Many people don't get jobs, especially if you're rich, right? Hey, but when are you gonna get pushed out into the woods and say, "Hey, dude, do it, do it," that this experience too of going out on your own would be to be guided by your spiritual guides, the to call upon your ancestors to sing certain songs, that you would be taught these certain songs and taught these certain ways of navigation to pull off the miracle of surviving and returning. Ooh. And so to imagine how what an experience it would be to come back, the journey on land and of the mind, the journey of initiation. So let's do some summary here, some overview. We're finding that in the historical context of the Aboriginals being isolated for the majority of human history, the vast majority of human history, that they would have stories that are carbon copies. I don't know if copies is the right word. They're analogous to stories from around the world. They are not unlike other peoples. The stories mirror the natives, the Greeks, the Europeans. In certain cases, I didn't mention it, but we're seeing some interesting syncretisms with Slavic paganism as well. I don't stand to answer the how here, but it's definitely a feeling of unity here, a mutual history, a mutual spirituality. This aspect too of the walkabout, of the initiation from boy into man. We see this everywhere in the ancient world. You saw more similar cases with the literal journey. You see that across tribes in Africa. You see the initiation from boy into man in European paganism. Um, man, man, there's a number of analogies that I wish I can in a later date tie closer to, right? Like this trope of the sun goddess, and in the particular cultures of which we find it, the trope of the trickster, in the particular cultures of which we find it. Do these things come up organically and of themselves, or are these things inspired by a mutual line of heritage? Because in regards to like tricksters, for instance, here we have the crow. Like I mentioned, in Native America we have coyote. In the Norse mythology we have Loki, right? um where are these things coming from? Where are they coming from? Now, as another mention that I want to touch on briefly, this aspect of the dream time, or our appropriated translation of the dream time. I think this really helps set a certain tone to consider when it comes to all the other sessions in the course as well. And that is the nature of story and the nature of time and the nature of dreams. How far off is reality from dreams? How far off of it is it, if not for sensory phenomena? Have you ever passed from one room to another, or realize all of a sudden, oh wait, here I am? A sudden blast of psyche, a certain blast of consciousness, where you're like, what day is? Oh, it's Tuesday. And then in the same way, this could be likened to dreams, where all of a sudden you're awake. Because how conscious are you really? If not only sometimes, even in your walking life, how often are you very present? And if life is just a intermediary period between death and rebirth, then how is this not like moving from dream to dream? That it could go dark for a bit and then you're in a dream. And that no matter where you exist, whether in that headspace or in this reality, there are always rules and there's always spirit to the realm of which you live, to the realm of which you breathe, to the realm of which you exist. So there's some real boundary dissolving to be had here. And our nature of needing truth in story, the truth of esotericism or whatever it is, right? What's that about? I mean, what's that really about? Uh, Anyhow, I'm going to close it with that.